We'll now be taking this discussion further with this first session called The Future of Sovereignty in an Interdependent World. Here's a look at that. Let's begin with the first panel discussion titled The Future of Sovereignty in an Interdependent World. Now, in the world we live in today, the nation state has become the primary structure that holds sovereignty, and it has perhaps become the best vehicle for achieving both economic development as well as modernization. However, since the world has become increasingly interdependent and sort of tied together through various blocs, alliances, as well as other organizations, one could argue that the notion of sovereignty of a nation has been somewhat diluted. Today, we're going to be looking at this concept and whether or not particular trends are making it a little more difficult for nations to establish themselves in an increasingly complex power dynamic. We're going to be looking at the issue of sovereignty, what it was, what it means today, and what shape it's likely to take in the future, and how our understanding of sovereignty can be adapted to an ever-increasing interdependent world. Enough said. All right, joining me for the first panel discussion is Tijjani Muhammad-Bande. Ambassador Muhammad-Bande previously served as the President of the United Nations General Assembly and is currently the permanent representative of Nigeria to that organization, to the United Nations. Hina Rabbani Khar is the former Foreign Minister of Pakistan, appointed at the young age of 33. She was the youngest person and the first woman to have held the position. Andreas Wimmer is a prize-winning author and a professor of sociology and political philosophy over at Columbia University. And Thomas Greminger. Thomas previously served as the Secretary General of the OSCE and is currently the Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure having your presence. Andreas, let me begin with you. You have written extensively on the topic of, or the concept of nationalism and nation building. If you could sort of set us up for this panel, talk to us about how this concept has evolved. Andreas, thank you. You talked about sort of economically and politically in terms of this concept. Thomas, let me bring you in. I mean, you've authored sort of numerous publications on military history and conflict management. Talk to us about how these concepts have sort of helped us understand this concept of sovereignty and that of nation building.
Of obviously intensifying, growing interdependencies, we see again an increased insistence on national sovereignty, and I think that is in a way it is counterintuitive, and I think it's partly this is driven by authoritarianism, authoritarian states that do insist on national sovereignty to basically fend off any attempts of foreign interference. But I think it's more than that. There is also a populist logic driving this revival of national sovereignty. There is this sense of people fearing, feeling uncertain due to probably a rapidly globalizing, rapidly changing world, and they want the state to protect them, and governments then in turn, perceive the same threats and the same concerns, and well, feel of course this pressure from the people to be protected. And then, well, what we see as a result is attempts to strengthen sovereignty by strengthening control over the borders, by limiting immigration, by building walls and fences, by keeping foreigners out. But at the same time, we obviously realize that most threats to sovereignty cannot be dealt with unilaterally, and it's a fact that states today are interlinked, interconnected, they're interdependent. If you look at supply chains, at transnational flows of money, people, goods, but also on how events in one part of the world impact on the security in others. Think of conflict, migration, terrorism, or even climate change. So basically, I would argue that in an interdependent world, national solutions are simply insufficient and often ineffective. And here the paradox comes in. The paradox in the sense that the trust in multilateralism is waning at the very time it would urgently be needed. And so we are kind of caught in a vicious circle where, leaders, governments, under pressure, seek national solutions to transnational problems. This erodes cooperation, yet because the policy is insufficient, people then lose faith in their governments and in international organizations to manage these issues effectively. So they look for more simple, for nativist solutions to deal with issues like pandemics, cyber attacks, migration, climate change, organized crime. And this again further breaks down multilateralism. And
Thomas,
as a reaction, in cases we are witnessing attempts at deglobalization, decoupling, renationalization, as we have seen with policies like America First or Brexit. But clearly, these policies will have its limitations in an interdependent world. And so I would argue the answer is greater cooperation in an interdependent world, because we cannot respond effectively to the challenges that we are currently facing otherwise.
Thomas, thank you very much. I think you and Andreas sort of gave a very good assessment of the situation sort of at 30,000 feet. And you talked about the vicious circle. And over the next hour and 20 minutes, we're going to see if there are ways, sustainable ways of addressing this paradox and getting out of this vicious circle. But I want to turn to Hina. One thing that sort of hasn't been mentioned by Thomas or Andreas is religion. And I want to ask you this question because you come from a country that is in a unique position. I mean, when Pakistan became a country back in 1947, it formed the largest Muslim state in the world at the time. The creation was a catalyst to the largest, perhaps, demographic movements of the time. Talk to us about this correlation.
Oh, okay. There are many more things to talk about also, but this correlation obviously is an important one and is a good one. And I think this is in some ways, you know, when the end of the Cold War, we talked about whether we were going to go the Fukuyama way, the end of history, or the Huntington way, which was clash of civilizations. I think many decades after that, it is safe to say that we went on the clash of civilizations way. And I feel that it's not only countries like Pakistan or other countries which are not right in the center of world power structure, but also countries within the world power structure are now trying to define themselves in more and more colloquial, smaller, civilizational terms. And there is this constant clash of us versus them, which you see in no less than the United States of America, even. And going to the whole theme of this particular session, you know, there is a rules-based order which was adopted post-World War II. But as a practitioner, and it's interesting that you mentioned that our two panelists before me talked from 30,000 feet and above. As a practitioner coming in from a country like Pakistan, I can tell you that the rules-based system was never as rules-based universally for everyone. And when we talk about the whole concept of sovereignty, I think some countries always uh, not chose to, but were allowed to be more sovereign than others. Many of the structures that we put in place, such as the IMF and its conditionalities, such as the Bretton Woods institutions, you know, and many other, the way we govern the world, the governance structure, ensured that different rules were applied to those who needed help from this system and those who were makers of the system. So it's interesting, and I completely agree with our panelists that in a time where you need the world to come together, like never before, climate change threatens each one of us, whether we're an island state or a hegemonic power. COVID taught us that if one person is infected, the whole world will come to a standstill in a way that we could have never thought possible. And yet, you see this urge, even within the liberal democratic world, to become less liberal and to want to become less interdependent and to be creating harsher, stronger borders, wanting to fence everything, wanting to create fortresses in many ways, fortresses for the rich world, fortresses within, you know, for the not so rich world, etc. So it's quite interesting, and I would want to also add that I feel, if I can be a bit more provocative, to say that the topic that we're discussing today is perhaps a decade old, and maybe the new issue, which is a threat to sovereignty and is perhaps creating, tremors in the world order and creating political chaos at many levels, is the data war and is the strength of who does not perhaps only have military hardware, but or who has access to more data and whose companies have access to more data. And I think that is the real game changer in the current world order.
Hina, thank you very much. I think sort of the common message coming out from all of you is that the world needs to come together. When you utter those words, I think it's undeniable that you have to think of the United Nations, and that's where I want to bring in Ambassador Muhammad-Bande. Let me ask you, you served at the very top of the General Assembly. There are analysts out there that perhaps accuse the United Nations of eroding sovereignty. Talk to us about how the formation of the United Nations and how it was sort of established during a time when we as mankind were re-evaluating the concept of sovereignty.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And let me also join others in saying that this is a very important forum. And I would like to say that the really operative word here is not, there are two words, both sovereignty and interdependence. And precisely you talk of the dawn of the period in terms of the creation of the organization, the United Nations organization, that is, the reality of the time was very evident for all to see, that we couldn't have a world in which power, whatever it was, of a nation or group of nations alone impacted the world so much, and chaos could ensue, and chaos did ensue. And the whole notion, therefore, of norms and rules were there. But let's also say, even at the beginning, it was clear that elements of realpolitik also played out in the creation of some of the institutions or structures within the organization itself. But the fundamental notion to be, we should pivot on, is the idea that no longer is any nation, however important it is, going to be the sole determinant of what happened or didn't happen in the world, because that was a world that was clearly a very unstable one. And therefore, if the real focus was really first and foremost to give peace a chance on a permanent basis, then the organization was needed. And there was a lot of forward thinking around the organization in relation to values of rights of individuals, but also of the sovereign right of states to determine elements that concern them. And this is the issue. Where the sovereignty, what is its real remit, and why is it impossible for us to stick within sovereignty? I think the whole question is this. The remit is that nations have histories, and there was no nation that was taken as a given. Nations evolved, and I'm glad the first speaker spoke about that evolution. Now we're not talking of empires, we're talking of nation states, which for today are undergirded by certain values which by and large are becoming global. But that they are global does not mean that they were created equally by all nations. I think that is the point our panelists from Pakistan wanted to raise. It is very easy to forget that while real progress has been made by the United Nations and what it has done for countries that were really in real trouble situation, including efforts to have decolonization, which the United Nations supported very greatly indeed. But still, to this day, the elements of who has power and who doesn't have power are actually is really haunting some aspects of the work of the United Nations. And this is something that we need to work together. And the whole question now, and the second speaker raised the issue, I think, very directly. Nothing can be solved. Most major problems, let me say today, cannot be solved by nation states. And that's why the notion of return to nationalism, as if that is a solution to problems, because really internal divisions within each nation or within most nations alone cannot be solved without reference to the outside world, because the outside world exists. It has a presence within all of us. And so, by and large, there is tension between notions of sovereignty and globalism, but neither is possible without the other. What is important is really deeper knowledge of where the proper boundaries are in relation to each issue. But this issue also must be looked at from the point of what values are beginning or have emerged from 1945 to guide formal relations among nations. Thank you.
Tijjani, thank you very much. Andreas, let me turn back to you. You've heard the other panelists speak, and I sort of want to sort of combine a little bit of something from each one. From the way that I see it is there are two sort of competing trends here. You have sort of the continued rise of sort of non-state actors, companies, multinational corporations, but then you also have the rise of nationalism, and you briefly touched upon that too. Talk to us about the delicate balance between this and the concept of sovereignty moving forward, the future of it?
Yes. To simplify greatly, one could say there is the tendency of further economic integration across the world. And so sovereignty in an economic sense is eroding and has been eroding very fastly over the last 20 years. In the political world, however, there is a tendency in the other direction with increasing emphasis, re-emphasis on national sovereignty by various governments around the world, in the north as well as in the south, by democratic regimes as well as not democratic regimes. So this, I think that's the biggest tension here. And I would like to say that the rise of neo-populist and nationalist politics that drives this re-emphasis on sovereignty, that is not a coincidence either. So people like us who are part of the global elite tend to say, oh, why is this happening? This is so deplorable. We should have more cooperation. We cannot solve the problems of the world by emphasizing sovereignty again. So that's our perspective. And but I think one has to also understand the reason why there is neo-populist, neo-nationalist politics around the world, in the US, in India, in the Philippines, in Southern American countries, in Europe, and so on and so on. And so I think one has to look at this from the point of view of how the global order that emerged in the last 20, 30 years, let's say after the end of the Cold War, who has it served, who has it not served? And I think it's important to realize that it has served economic and political elites around the world extraordinarily well. It has served certain countries, China, South Korea, and others, Chile, extraordinarily well. And it has not served other kinds of peoples very well. Those who don't have the education, who don't have the resources to compete successfully in a globalized economic world, have actually not profited greatly, have not advanced as much as they had hoped for in the last 20 to 30 years. So economic globalization has produced these winners, if you want to put it in this way, in these stark terms, but also losers. And in a world where you have political order, where democracy is important, where, or at least orientation towards the interests of the majority, even if it doesn't take on a perfect liberal democratic form. In a world like that, the frustrations of those who lost out in the global competitive game become important, and they fuel neo-nationalisms, they fuel the desire to reorient global politics, but also national politics, reoriented towards the interests of the majority of the people, including those who have actually not, for whom economic globalization has not been beneficial. So I think when we talk about, when we deplore how bad it is for the international cooperation and so on to have these neo-nationalist politics, it's also important to understand where it comes from. So it is a direct reaction towards economic globalization of the last 20, 30 years. And it takes on different forms in the north, as opposed to the south. It takes on different forms in the east as opposed to the west. But I think the general message that the unrestricted economic globalization, financial globalization, and so on of the 30 years has fueled neo-nationalism. I think that's a general argument that applies both to the north and the south, and the east and the west.
Tomas, is that sort of the, I know that you're taking notes, so I want to get your thoughts on it. I mean, is sort of that the common denominator here when you look at sort of the lopsided benefits of economic globalization, you know, them being the neo-populism, the nationalism being sort of a hurdle here?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with Andreas' assessment. Indeed, the type of economic globalization that we have seen over the last 20 years has clearly led to winners and losers, and the losers are frustrated, and I believe rightly so. If you see the rising inequalities on our globe, I think this is a very telling indicator uh, that would call for a different type of globalization, and it would also call for questioning this neoliberal type of globalization. So I totally agree with the assessment. The point is a bit, what is then the way forward? And particularly, if I look again as a security expert, I look at the security challenges that we are currently facing, and here. Indeed, while there is neo-populism, while there is neo-nationalism, at the same time, I think we must all realize that these answers are not going to take us to effective uh, solutions for the challenges we have referred to: climate change, environmental degradation, but also, the impact of technology on our lives. This is also something that even the biggest power can only to a limited way address that unilaterally. Um, uh, Pandemics, arms control, transnational organized crime, cyber threats, nuclear safety, all these are issues where states have no other choice than than to work together. And and there is often, this notion by those that advocate these national sovereignty approaches, that this is all a bit naive, etc. But here I would argue cooperation is at the end, if you face the challenges we are currently facing, is realpolitik, and it's not altruism. And I kind of liked the Secretary General Antonio Guterres saying at the previous year's General Assembly that in an interconnected world, it is time to recognize a simple truth: solidarity is self-interest. And he said, and I think that is very telling. So I guess we will have to find ways to get beyond these neo-populist tendencies. But I would totally agree, we need a different model of economic globalization.
Let me turn to you. As a politician who hails from a developing country, perhaps one that has not fully benefited from the economic globalization that Thomas and Andreas were talking about, how do you get a more equitable deal?
Okay, so first of all, I think what the question that is the looming question is: do we want an equitable deal? Other countries and the entities which are supposed to be the setters of rules want a more equitable world order for everyone. I think the current crisis, if I may call it, between China and US, in many ways is very telling on how US is feeling very threatened when competition seems to be arising from a country which is actually becoming a real competitor in the global sense on every front, whether it's economic or political or military. And in that, the reaction of the US has been no different than the reaction of many other countries as to going and saying, nationalistic to a very high order. And to that front, I just want to say that you see, the world, the realpolitik, the way things have played out, has been very different than the way the rules have been made. Okay, so when we say fair competition and fair trade for everyone, it has really not been that, right? When we talk about subsidies, we all know that the European Union allowed huge farmer subsidies, whereas a country like Pakistan would never be allowed to give its own farmers subsidies. And going back to the world order and the way we have emerged, I think one major shift, if you can say, when I was growing up back in the 1990s, we all looked at the Asian tigers as the example of what it means to adapt to and adopt the global economic order and to benefit from it. And countries like Pakistan were lining up, wanting to be the next Asian tiger. But I think 2008 and the financial crisis of 2008 sort of revealed that the countries which were most adapt to or had adapted to that particular economic order were the most exposed in many ways. And the countries which were the best off after the economic crisis were the ones which had a sort of a hybrid model of economic liberalism. And therefore, today, I think the elephant in the room is this contrast that is being presented, which is, I feel, the US is overreacting to, and the West is overreacting to in many ways, that the threat of this order or the system of governance that they feel is coming from, if I can call it the Chinese model or similar models like that. And today, many countries are finding the strength to be able to say that, yes, the global order has not served us very well. And it's interesting because I completely agree with what Andrea said. There were winners and there were losers. And these winners cannot be really divided only in the political, economic elite and a certain country and not the political and economic elite or certain countries. But we saw that in pretty much every country, the middle class down did not feel they benefited from this very much. And therefore, you see that reaction in countries like the US electing Trump on the promise of closing down borders and closing down trade. And you see the UK opting out of the European Union. And we, in the South, continued to give examples of the European Union to try and get South Asia to come together. And here we are now left with no examples to give. So I feel the world is far more complex than we have the ability to even, forget discuss in a session, but write in tomes also. And what is going to come out of it is going to be a result of many different frictions, reactions that are happening. I just feel, and I would want to end this particular interjection with that point, I just feel that our reaction is very dangerous. From a point where we were wanting everybody to become part of the global order, today the countries which were supposed to be the preservers and protectors of the world order are the ones who are wanting some countries out and are building forces, and I do not mean military forces only, I mean economic, diplomatic push against those countries. And this is, to me, a very, very worrisome sign.
Tijjani, let me ask you, I mean, does the United Nations have the tools, does it have the drive, does it have the motivation to deal with this complex situation that Hina was talking about? I mean, obviously there is a threat to this world order. What can it do?
Thank you very much. I think it's interesting that I see elements of what I would agree in all of the positions, whether they are of the one pushing in relation to integration or the ones that are questioning whether this is helpful. I think several questions are important to ponder over. First of all, the situation would have been far worse for individual human beings around the world if there were no United Nations to still say, no, this is what we agreed to. And there is really no country, however important, that really is happy to be outside the fold of the United Nations in terms of whether it is operating right or wrong. This is a control of itself rather than a situation whereby it's like a recent state. We are far away from that one. And I like the notion of solidarity, which the last but one speaker raised. Solidarity is ineffectual, but it's still important. It really brings together. Let us talk about the current pandemic. There is no question that enlightened self-interest is not a new matter, but it has become even more so in relation to the current pandemic, which we are hopefully getting out of. The whole idea that we have to get everyone vaccinated and resources are made available, not perfectly, at least tells us that it is clear that there can be no economic recovery for any one country without looking around the globe to say this has to be contained also. We can quibble as we do whether it is right today to have 3 shots boosters in some countries, 1 in other countries, not even 5% have been vaccinated. But to the real question then is, the United Nations, in terms of its ability to understudy, to study what is going on around the world, in terms of its insistence on reduction, if not elimination, of inequalities, the whole question of controlling nuclear arms, whatever the limitations relating to implementation, a lot of work every day is being done to see that the situation improves, or at least it doesn't get worse. And it may not be a very bright thing to say, but imagine a situation where there were no such an organization. And back to the whole question of sovereignty issues. A lot of things that are created today that have value are created not by governments, but by corporations. And it's not one country that will guide how corporations operate, and a global system that also gives a sense of how corporations are expected to behave responsibly around the globe, I think is helpful. Whether you're talking of technologies for agriculture or for whatever, they are things that immediately are of value to many places, and they are produced by a company, and these companies are owned by perhaps individual citizens around the world. This is important. The emergence even today of a whole notion of global citizen, I'm glad that the moderator made reference to this word earlier, the global elite. Now, I would not like to say global elite, but at least there is a notion around the young people and around many concerning how they are connected to the world in ways that are new, that are useful, but at times can be also disruptive. So my conclusion is this: the United Nations is the best platform to address the really difficult questions that have been raised concerning migration, concerning inequalities, concerning technology, which is really, really key. And I like the way our sister raised it earlier. The ICT is key in terms of reduction of inequality. But at the base of it is the whole question of eradication of poverty and mutual respect. Because the cultural element, and that has been spoken about, is not just economic issues, but really how do countries, individuals relate to cultures. I think these elements also feed into the whole notion that the second speaker raised very eloquently concerning new nationalism. And I think, let me leave it at this: the United Nations is relevant. It is not doing a perfect job, because power relations and realpolitik does also play, but it is muted because no country can do as it wishes in the UN, however powerful. Thank you.
Tijjani, thank you. Tomas, let me come to you for a second. I mean, how do you think one concept that I believe hasn't been talked about that much, which should be, is the pandemic that we're in? I mean, how do you think COVID-19 has sort of affected all this and highlighted some of the changing roles?
I think the jury is still out. Historians might see the way we dealt with the pandemic as a turning point, again, away from unilateral approaches to more multilateral cooperation. I mean, if we look at wave one, clearly we saw lots of unilateral reactions. Borders were closed down, export restrictions were imposed. But then gradually, I think we also saw political leadership towards trying to come up with joint responses in dealing with the pandemic as such, but also in coping with the socio-economic consequences. And for instance, if you look at this landmark summit of the European Union last July, that then took a decision on the largest ever package to stimulate the post-COVID economy. I think, and then when I see, to what extent now more recently, and I agree, rather late, it should have happened sooner, but now investments in COVAX, making sure that it is not only the rich, the Europeans and the Americans that get the vaccines, but everybody else. I think these are all arguments that we do see a strengthened belief in multilateral responses to the pandemic. And I do hope that historians will tell us in 5-10 years the pandemic, COVID-19, was a turning point in the way we are dealing with global challenges.
Hina, let me turn to you. I mean, obviously, Tomas is saying the jury's still out on this, but do you agree that it's also highlighted the good and the bad?
Can hear?
Yeah. I think.
Sorry. Okay.
Hina.
No, I'm sorry for that. I just unmuted myself. So I was just saying that I wish I had Thomas's optimism, and there is obviously a need for that optimism. But I'm rather cynical on the direction that the world has taken, and I will just say it again. Look, people are opting out of alliances rather than opting into alliances. The 2008 financial crisis, after that, we thought that we were going more towards regionalism and less towards globalism. But now it feels that we are literally wanting to be solo flights altogether. And I am absolutely clear on the need for the United Nations and global governance structure. But I'm also very clear that that global governance structure has to truly respect everyone as a sovereign equal. I see the way the world has operated in the last 20 years or so has been a lot of pick and choose. I, being powerful, can get away with, breaking the rules and not looking for UN approval or Security Council vote. And the weak must be, fully comply. I think that maybe some of my cynicism may also be from the fact that my country has been on the periphery of one major intervention which did not go very well, the one in Afghanistan, that we saw unfold in front of us on the 15th of August, just this year. And many of the things which were unilateral, such as the use of drone strikes, such as the use of extreme military, which was harming civilians in large numbers, all of that had an impact on how the world is perceived by those who are sitting on the periphery, by those who were wanting the world to deliver to them, such as the many Afghans that we still feel have been dealt a terrible hand by their own leadership, but generally. But as far as this particular COVID-19 is concerned, I feel it has absolutely given us a clear message and a warning signal that the world requires collective solution, and we cannot take care of ourselves and isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. The world, any wrong happens anywhere else in the world, it will come back to haunt us. But I feel in a reaction to COVID-19, especially in the beginning, every country wanted to fend for itself. And when enough was left over, then we decided to be, magnanimous in many ways. Okay, so I think this is the lesson in making right now, as we speak, that we cannot, build fortresses in today's world. Now we need to revert to an order to the same structure, perhaps, but to be able to change it, to adapt it to the to a changed world. So truly, the world has changed. Technology has transformed everything, our access to information, how we view each other culturally, everything. But the world order, or the structure which is supposed to deliver to us, has remained stagnant. So that change through an evolutionary process, or through a process which is obviously agreed upon by all the member states, is an important process to change that, but also to make it more equitable than it was before.
Andreas, if everything else around us has changed but the world order, what do we do? I mean, if you want to sort of pick up where Hina left.
Yes, well, I also share Hina's skepticism about the rather optimistic assessment of Thomas of what's the lesson from COVID. Imagine what could have happened, which is that the United Nations or the World Health Organization would have coordinated the pandemic responses, that vaccines would have produced wherever they were produced under the umbrella of the World Health Organization and distributed in an equitable way across the North-South divide. So that would have been, a turning point towards increasing multilateralism, towards increasing international cooperation, but that's not what happened. The opposite happened. Everybody rushed basically to outcompete other countries with their response, closing borders, each country developing policies that were basically exclusively oriented towards their own populations. So you can see how the built-in nationalism, built into the international structure of a world of sovereign nation states, how this nationalism came to the foreground again, and every government just cared for the interest of their own populations and could not care less about what's happening across their own borders. So that's the lesson. The European Union might be an exception, but I mean, the European Union is just one little part of Asia in the West, and I don't think that it has, from a global perspective, that many lessons for us to tell. So what's the future of cooperation? I want to come back to what Hina said also about the alternative model that China offers to countries around the world, an alternative way of doing politics and of economic management as well, an alternative alliance partner also to the West and the hegemonic US power. So what this means is basically that you have global competition, a new Cold War, as it were. And it also, unfortunately, means that the United Nations, with its structure that is basically an inheritance of the Second World War, with the veto powers, of which China is one and the US is one, is basically blocked. So if you have this kind of global competition between two different development models, two different alliance systems, two different economic alliance systems as well, with the Roads and Belts Initiative and so on, basically replacing all the IMF and World Bank structure that existed during the American hegemonic period. So with that, the United Nations cannot be what it could maybe be in another situation. It cannot be the nucleus of a renewed more cooperative order, I'm afraid. And so what are we going to see in the future? I think, as Thomas said before, there is self-interest of governments around the world to cooperate on things that they have to cooperate, that they cannot solve on their own. So we're going to see punctual cooperation between groups of states, or sometimes maybe even on a semi-global order, cooperation that solves punctual problems such as cyber threats, such as ecological problems, such as security problems, and so on. So it's going to be a world with very fleeting, very unstable arrangements of cooperation between states that might not coalesce into what global elites like us would like to have, which is, a robust, institutionally structured level of global governance. So that's how I see the future. So it's going to be much more sovereign, if you want to come back to the topic of our panel, than let's say 10, 15 years ago. It's not the end of international cooperation, but cooperation will take on a different form. And it will move away from the UN, I'm afraid, which is going to be blocked by the China-US rivalry, and it's going to be much more decentralized and fragmented.
Tijjani, how do you feel when you hear words like that? The world is going to be moving away from the United Nations, that the world's largest collective body sort of missed a golden opportunity when it comes to this pandemic, and it's not going to be the nucleus in this bipolar world. What do you say to that?
Well, I think I understand the frustration of a political philosopher like myself, and I think it's good to ring the warning bells, which is as he saw them. I see it a bit differently, while I take in some of the elements he has raised. The United Nations is not set up, and it's not going to be helpful if it were to be looked at as a world government. It isn't. The United Nations is still an organization of nation states that are trying to adjust as best they can to address current and emergent global problems. And it has saved us from, I believe, continued nuclear problems which really brought us to the organization. It has created a lot of good things relating to the economy, economic integration, technology, even cultural elements, including relations among states in maritime and related issues, including human rights issues. These are extremely important things, and I think I am not looking at a world in which the UN or anybody that is to take over from them will be regionally based. I don't think that will function. But I take it that the continued hold on the United Nations in key moments relating to war and peace, as is evident in the way the Security Council operates now, must change. There are processes that have been extremely stalled, but I'm sure they will change, because it cannot continue to have we cannot continue to have a world as defined in 1945 guiding us. That's for sure. In the long term, I'm sure this will change, but I do not see the UN disappearing or being replaced. And fleeting arrangements, I think, will be the worst for humanity, because they'll be therefore really driven by utilitarian, just for now moment. And I think we certainly can see the instability that will generate. And I am more hopeful than had been sketched in that, but I can see the dangers that are raised, because every day there are discussions in the UN around the oversized influence of particular nations on the rest of the world. This is not right, but the structures that are here are addressing what they can address, but they need change, and they are changing, not fast enough. Nonetheless, let me close by saying that clearly there must be reform, and reform is happening. It's not fast enough, and that the UN or any organization that is to replace it will not be regional. It has to be all of us, and the rules will continue to evolve. The pandemic is a real wake-up call, absolutely, in relation to matters to do with global health, which has given us really a good jolt. We do need to be less nationalistic, but countries reacted as best they knew. Protect those that have voted you. Otherwise, there will be instability. Otherwise, you'll have no authority to do anything. Meanwhile, there is not, and I don't think there will be, a world government, which the United Nations isn't, and it should not aspire to be. It's dependent on cooperation. It should work to improve the cooperation to do things more quickly and more equitably. Thank you.
Andreas, let me turn back to you if I could. I mean, you said that we're going to see a shift to a world where there are more unstable agreements. That being said, I mean, if you consider the fact that the idea of nationalism and the idea of a nation state pretty much didn't exist until a couple of centuries ago, with your vision of the future of how things are likely to proceed, do you feel that there's a possibility to transform into a post-national world? And how do you think this will sort of affect the concept of sovereignty we see it today?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think we have to distinguish the short term and the long term. And if we talk about the very long term, that means centuries, then of course the world in 300 years from now or 200 years from now is going to be a very different world. Most likely, it's not going to be a world of sovereign nation states, each ruled in the name of a specific people. 200 years ago, the world was ruled by empires. It was maybe one or two nation states. And today, as I said at the beginning, we're in a world of nation states united in the United Nations on the basis of the idea of national sovereignty. So this world is going to disappear. What is it going to be replaced with? Of course, nobody knows. One could imagine a world where there's no states, where the idea of territorially bounded, institutionally structured states has disappeared, and there's going to be a network of overlapping arrangements to provide public goods, to provide security, and so on and so on. The new technologies will make such a world possible. It could also be that the vision that some people had at the end of the Cold War of a slowly emerging global governance structure becomes true. The vision that a lot of people who are in the UN actually is this idea of global governance and a global state becomes true. Also a possibility. Or we could see an expansion of the European model, that other regions band together and we have these giant continental states, that all of the Americas become one state, that the European Union becomes a sovereign state rather than the current federal structure, that all of East Asia under the leadership of China becomes a single state, that the Islamic world becomes one global state. So all of this is, I mean, it's fun to think about this because it's so far removed into the future that basically anything goes. But in the next generation, so as long as the people who are here on this panel will live and maybe their children, it is very unlikely that something like that will emerge. It is much more likely that the idea of national sovereignty that is built into the current state system will survive. And in my view, it has been greatly strengthened over the last couple of years and during COVID. And it just takes one populist American president to get rid of all the illusions of global equity and global governance. So, and to go back to strengthened emphasis on national sovereignty, on national interests, and so on and so on. So I think that the nation state, for better or for worse, and the politics that it creates, both domestically but on an international level as well, is here to stay for at least our generation and probably next. That doesn't mean that everything is the same. Yeah, sorry.
No,
I'll stop here.
I'm sorry, Andreas. Please continue.
No, I just wanted to say that obviously it doesn't mean that everything is static. There's going to be evolution. There's going to be adaptations. What does the rise of China really mean? How will it change the international system? Will there be large-scale war? Can it be avoided? I mean, all of this is open, and all of these rearrangements of the global power structure will, of course, also have consequences for the role of sovereignty. So it's not going to be a static world, but I think the basic principles of national sovereignty is going to be staying with us for a while.
Thomas, I know that you're sort of nodding your head in agreement with Andreas at one point. Do you sort of share the same outlook?
Well, I would definitely agree with Andreas' interpretation, assessment of current trends. I see this increased geopolitical competition. I see deepening divides between China, the US, China perhaps, and the West, and for that matter, a further deepening divide between Russia and the West. At the same time, I think there is also some light at the end of the tunnel, that there is a realization, and I think now in the second and third phase of responding to COVID-19, we clearly saw a move away from purely unilateral, purely transactional responses, because as Hina said, there was a realization that this is not conducive to dealing with a transnational, a global challenge. But I'm not saying that this will be the dominant pattern of dealing with global challenges from now on. But at the same time, I think I would continue to advocate for cooperative approaches if we want to effectively and successfully deal with the challenges that we have alluded to. And let me perhaps add another thought. I think it is not always, the multilateral way. I think it's very much a matter of smartly combining bilateral and multilateral cooperation, regional and global cooperation. As a former head of a regional organization, I can also see that at times regional organizations, according to Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, can make a tremendous contribution. And I can also see that when you have bilateral mechanisms, platforms totally blocked, as this is, for instance, currently the case when it comes to European security, you see most multilateral fora blocked. Well, then perhaps an impulse coming from a bilateral level, can unblock and give a signal towards also then more constructive work on a multilateral body. I, for instance, would hope that now that we've had 2 rounds of strategic stability talks in Geneva between the United States and Russia, that this will eventually then also positively influence those multilateral platforms that are currently, unfortunately, totally blocked, but extremely important for our security.
Thomas, thank you very much. Hina, both Thomas and Andreas sort of talked about China and the divide between the United States and China as well. Pakistan is a country that's no doubt deep in this divide. But you said that countries in the future are going to be opting out of alliances. I mean, if the divide between the United States and China is going to deepen, put that in perspective for me.
No, absolutely. I mean, I would say when I talked about countries getting out of alliances, I did not mean alliances, but regional forums. So regional cooperation forums, such as the SAARC, such as the European Union, for instance, which got a hit when the UK opted out, right? That does take away a bit of the legitimacy of how it was perceived by at least one large country within the within the erstwhile European Union. On the other hand, my scare is, and my concern is, and I feel that we, because we are sitting right in that region, are seeing the tremors already that maybe the rest of the West is not experiencing. and many other countries far away may not be experiencing, such as Africa also. But we feel the deepening interest of the US in the Indo-Pacific region and its formulation of the US-China rivalry to have already have significant impact in the region that I'm sitting in. Okay, so you see that this whole concept of us versus them is being magnified and is being deeply rooted as opposed to us, the world, all right? And it's the whole concept of alliances being built where, you know, India, despite going in a non-secular direction and perhaps a direction that the US would have called out upon earlier, 10 years back, would not be doing so because now it feels that it is part of the containment China policy. And really, India can have any record on religious freedom, on human rights. It will the other way, most of the West, because of the reality of the need for a power such as that to counter an emerging China. So this us, we are one alliance, and you, if you're not part of our alliance, are then clearly part of the other alliance, is actually deepening, and it's very, very dangerous. I also want to say that I feel very strongly that when a power which is indisputed as the leader of the world, okay, both for the fact that it has some hegemonic power and because of the fact that it has been the propagator, promoter of values that we all aspire to, such as international trade, even more importantly, human rights, even more importantly, democratic values. Now, when those states themselves start being less democratic, start being less preservers of human rights for themselves within their nation state and elsewhere, it sends tremors all over the world. You see, so if Pakistan decides to go the wrong way, Pakistan affects its 220 million people. But when a big power of the world decides to go the way that, you know, many countries have decided and are showing trends for, and especially during the Trump years, getting out of the climate change, Paris Climate Agreement, blocking the WTO from functioning fully, these are not what a great leader, a leading state does. A leading state gets others to be part of it and gives impetus and strength to these governance structures. So in my mind, the world as we see it today, the need, as I said before, of a global structure or governance structure of the UN being a functional body is the highest. But the US being the functional body is at its lowest. The UN has, I meant the UN before also, the UN has dramatically lost its relevance as being the arbitrator on political, diplomatic disputes and on being the solution provider, as Andreas very correctly pointed out, on global crises such as COVID. With the WHO there, you saw the voice of WHO, but you did not see the functionality of WHO because nobody was willing to adapt and adopt it. So you did not see the UN playing a lead role. You saw the UN complying with maybe when the countries eventually did come around to saying, okay, we will comply with whatever you're projecting. I mean, till today, each one of us, as we travel, we have to get different vaccines. We have to go through every country's different requirements. Why can we not have global requirements of what, you know, travel requirements should be? And why not, once WHO has approved a vaccine, must it be approved for all countries? These are all trends which show that we have already rejected in many ways the arching role of what we had all ascribed to earlier as the word of God in the UN system.
All right. Andreas, I want to say we have about 20 minutes left in this panel, so I want to switch gears. I want to sort of shift our attention to a different topic. Hina was talking about, you know, besides the World Health Organization having a face but not a voice, and, you know, she talked about us versus them. And that's where I want to sort of pick up here. Isn't it a bit trickier when you add in a different dimension? And what I mean by that different dimension is, so you have a national level and you have a global level, but you also have a local level as well. Doesn't this further complicate things in terms of confronting sort of challenges?
Yes, so I think you're talking about the nested nature of identities. So you have within country differences along religious lines, racial lines, ethnic, linguistic lines, and so on. And then you have the level of differences between between nations and countries. And then you have the regional level, you have the Muslim world, you have the Western Christian world, you have sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. The clash of civilization, as it were, level of differentiation. And then you have global alliance systems such as China and all its allies, and the US and its allies. And there's some kind of also identity component to that global rivalry as well. The China model also comes with a certain kind of cultural template, the idea of a paternalistic state rather than a democratic state, the idea of harmony and social order as opposed to the idea of freedom and competition. And so it's a complex structure where you have different levels of identity nested into each other. And that does complicate, of course, and always has complicated politics greatly, because there is movements, social movements, political movements, and so on that are associated with all these different levels. And so it's a very complicated, if you look at it from a global point of view, a very complicated system. And it is not clear how the resurgence of nationalism, so the increased emphasis on this national level of differentiation, where one nation stands in opposition to another, how that actually affects the other levels. Does it lead to less salience, less political relevance of subnational, let's say regional or ethnic or racial or religious kind of divisions within countries? I actually don't think so. So it looks like rather than a renewed period of nation building where within these countries people would come together, not so much emphasize their different interests and identities, rather than a renewed period of nation building, we see within countries also fragmentation along these lines, with the rise of subnational identity politics. And of course, the US is a very good example, but you can see similar trends within Western Europe, within other countries around the world, including, by the way, in China. But so what does this all amount to? I think it amounts to a world where not only do we have less global cooperation and certainly less institutionalized cooperation, it also is a world where within countries, political fragmentation is going to continue. You can see that in party systems, in those that have proportional electoral systems, where fragmentation immediately shows up in the party systems, where you have new parties popping up and so on and so on. You can see this fragmentation of the political sphere in many different countries. And so overall, a great increase in complexity, and despite the resurgence of nationalism, not actually a more, let's say, national coherence at that level. I'm sorry, we are very pessimistic on this panel. I think we need somebody needs to step up and come up with a grand vision for the future where everything is better.
Let's turn to the United Nations for that. Tijjani, I mean, if we need more cooperation, less fragmentation, if we have a competition at a national level, isn't that going to sort of adversely affect the subnational categories, as Andreas was saying?
I think it is both ways. Competition nationally also affects competition. Competition among nations also legitimizes competition within nations. It's not just one way. If it's legitimate for us to quibble over small things with our neighbors, the next state and the next states at the other layer, then it also legitimizes smaller differences within nations. And I think, and the whole question of optimism, I come back to the question, the United Nations was never meant to be a world government, but it is created on the idea that human beings can work together. Even when differences will continue to be negotiated and solutions found. And some of the issues raised concerning misfit between what is written, what is said, and what happens. I think this in politics throughout history. These are tendencies in all political systems, because political systems are never perfect, but they can continue to emerge and solve problems. And with, I think, more knowledge, more empathy we expect. Of course, it doesn't always work out in the same way, but at least broadly, better understanding. And I think some of the stresses, I think, have been raised because of the era of technology that is instantaneous. And you have citizen groups getting support from all kinds of places around the world, dealing with an issue to amplify it. These are realities I want you to understand. But within all this, human beings condemn war, condemn rape, condemn inequality, and say that it is good to be protective of our neighbor, even when we dispute this. I think these positive things at times we tend to take for granted. They are there, they're important. And I think that's what I'm trying to say, that yes, the response to the pandemic, as it emerged, everybody was afraid. And politicians would want to protect those who have elected them. And it is not an issue of one country versus the other. It is globally everybody doing this. But as our senses came back to us, we really came to the whole notion, which is not contested now, that nobody is safe until all are safe. Within this, then, where do we continue to reduce the gap between what we say and what we do, and try to work at it? Because what is the work of diplomacy? We must work at it, until such a time that even those we disagree with on big things can still see that there are areas of cooperation. And I'm glad one of the speakers raised the conversation now between Russia and the US. And so this issue of blocks necessarily, inevitably fighting it out with other blocks is broken, because bilateral efforts come into it. I think the complexity is what I want us to bring, and then even with this movement, you can see positive things happening in terms of youth connected to the world, mobilizing about empowerment, mobilizing about rights of women all over the world, right to education, the whole question of inequality, the whole question of poverty. These are the issues. And then talking to culture, again, the cultural element in terms of how we must see that cultures also come into play as how things are understood. And I think the United Nations have given that platform. It is also learning from countries. This is the issue. And the UN has not been sleeping in relation to each of these issues. But it is also dependent partly on how nations also support it to push in one direction. I think this is what I just want to bring to it, that a lot of good things have happened, are happening. The UN, with all its difficulties, and these difficulties I and one of the, literally all the speakers have pointed to, is still pushing in a direction that would help. Absent it, and we realize how difficult it is, whether it's peacekeeping, whether it's the whole question of WHO, even if there was a pushback against the WHO, the United Nations and the bulk of countries in the world supported the World Health Organization and gave it the authority it needed. It's now, because of the pandemic, we understand that the model of funding it must change, because if it is dependent on one or two nations, and there is nothing we are giving it to ensure it works, then now we have learned that it is far weaker in the way it was structured than we had imagined. And now I think something good will happen out of this. Let me close by saying that we are going to have, in a few weeks' time, a COP meeting in Glasgow. And this tells you the world is still working toward big solutions. And this is, as big as it is, the climate issue is important. And despite the difficulties, I personally think Glasgow will find us something to be even more hopeful than we had done in, say, Madrid. Thank you.
Thank you, Tijjani. I mean, Tomas, let me turn to you. You know, Tijjani said it's not country versus country, as Tijjani said. I mean, so I want to ask you to what extent do regional and sort of transnational organizations play a role in this, in making things better? You know, Tijjani was mentioning COP26 upcoming in Glasgow in about 10 days. Give an example for climate change.
I think while I would totally agree with Andreas' assessment that fragmentation makes institutionalized cooperation more challenging, more difficult. I think at the same time, the good news is that cooperation is still possible despite of major divergences. Cooperation is possible without sharing values. I think what you need is a political commitment to genuine dialogue, a dialogue that allows us to identify converging interests, and climate change is clearly one, but hopefully not the only one. And this would then also allow to agree on selected areas of cooperation, while at the same time disagreeing on values on many things. And I think here regional but also global organizations, can provide platforms for these kinds of conversations where we may identify those areas where we want to cooperate, and at the same time acknowledging that major divergences will remain out there, and but I think that is the call of the day, and that is also what cooperative security is all about. Identifying areas where interests converge, where we want to cooperate, and at the same time, agreeing that we disagree on many issues.
Hina, Tomas said cooperation is possible without sharing values. Do you agree with that? And sort of bring that into context with regards to sort of multinational companies, if they're an opportunity or if they're a challenge for national governments when it comes to enforcing sovereignty?
I don't look at them as a threat at all. I think they have a role. I think the world has adapted to that role. I would be, the jury is still out there perhaps on the technology companies and what they are doing and are likely to do in the future, and how their role still becomes larger than many perhaps sovereign states. But I would tend to sort of believe somewhere in the middle that yes, it is it is possible to cooperate, but I genuinely believe that the world, I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, that the world governance structure is the one that was created post Second World War. And it has not really evolved or changed to respond to the changing realities of the world, primarily the ones which have come in from access to technology far and wide in the villages, streets of literally every nation state, right? And because of that, as someone who's worked in the UN, for a UN Secretary General's panel to engineer change in development and how development assistance and some of the organizations work, I believe that every time we want to do something to change, we actually add more and more layers and make it more bureaucratic and more complicated rather than less, right? But at the same time, I think in the world, what we have is that people who may come from very different religions, from different nation states, from perhaps even different geography, different history, are able to become a powerful voice through Twitter, through various social platforms, to engineer change in the way the world is being run. Okay, and that has become a very, very powerful tool and powerful voice. And in many ways, this is to me the only trend which shows that nation states, as in the territorial states, and their role versus the role of values that we all aspire towards. And I just want to point out towards the end that I genuinely believe that one major problem is when our sense of identity, how we identify our strengths, becomes smaller and smaller. Rather than being able to live with multiple identities, we want to hold on to one identity which may be antagonistic to another. And therefore, this whole question of us versus them, our system is good, their system is bad, our religion is good, their religion is bad. And I completely agree with the point that Andreas made in the beginning, that subnational identity politics just shows how what is happening at the global level is filtering down at the very, very local level. So you may say, oh, this nation state is only for the Muslims. Okay, and then you start asking, but it is more a nation state for the Shia Muslims, or this one is more the nation state for the Sunni Muslims. And then you say, okay, Sunni Muslims, and then you say, oh, but within the Sunni Muslims also there is this division and that division. So you keep on fragmenting until you reach an identity which is so small and that it has to be one which is antagonistic with anyone who's not you. And that unfortunately is happening a little bit on the global level, which concerns me. I think I would just like to end at the note that the governance structure needs to adapt to the world which has already changed. The people of the world has changed, but the governance structure remains archaic and decades old.
Andreas, do you believe that technology and the advancement in technology, as Hina was talking about, sort of that also aids fragmentation? Because, like she said, there are these technology companies that are providing these huge platforms for everybody. And if everybody comes out with a voice, and everybody and each voice adds another layer to it, doesn't it make it all the more complicated?
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it also changes how information is flowing. And there's several trends here, that the rise of social media and internet mediated communication comes with. And so one is it fuels, and there's actually good research showing that, political polarization. So when people get their news not from a national TV station, that's how I grew up, and Thomas can confirm that as a fellow Swiss, there was basically one channel when we grew up that everybody was watching religiously, the 8 o'clock, or what was it, 7:30 evening news. So that has completely disappeared in every country that I know around the world, with very few exceptions. And so people get their news from their Facebook feeds, they get their news from their Twitter feeds, they get their news from their whatever platform they're on the internet, and that leads to polarization because there's no longer a shared basis of information. People are not talking about the same things. They live in different worlds, different facts, different opinions that are taken for granted. And that's further fueling this dynamic of political polarization. And that's true at the national level, but it's also true at the international level. If I talk to my colleagues in China, people who are in think tanks or in international relations departments at universities, they live in a different world in terms of what they take for granted, the information sources that they have. So that's one trend. But then there's also another one, and since we're trying to be optimistic, we have only 1 minute left. Let me say that the internet and these kind of social media mediated platforms have also given rise to, especially among young people of a certain political orientation around the world, have given rise to more considerations of the fate of others, more direct exposures to the fate of other people, maybe across the world, maybe in a completely different corner, maybe from completely different cultural backgrounds than ever before. So you have a kind of a universalistic orientation that's just one stream, and maybe it's not the dominant one, but it is one stream of the new technology-mediated communication. And I think that is actually an important trend to build upon and to reinforce. So there's now a global public for maybe more cosmopolitan politics than ever before.
Andreas, like you said, we're coming to the end of our session, so if I get some closing remarks from all of you. Hina, let me start with you.
The world is has become less global, I think, in the last 10 years or so. And I feel that the value system that we all aspire towards for ourselves, if that becomes the same that we aspire for others, much of the problems that we feel within nations will disappear. And I feel that we are currently being threatened by this sense of rivalry between the West and in emerging China, which will have repercussions which are very, very dangerous. So I would hope that we can come around to seeing that as to see some common platform, to look at this as an opportunity to have common solutions for what are, frankly speaking, common problems.
Ambassador Muhammad-Bande, I'll give you about a minute and a half.
I think for me, the fact that we have agreed to global goals that
Are we hearing the ambassador?
broad and wide. Hello?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. What I'm saying that for me, it's positive that we have a world that has agreed to certain goals and committed to leaving no one behind as ethical principles. And it is important to continue to work at our being held accountable and to the words we have uttered as countries, as organizations. And in that effort, I think companies, international NGOs, and organizations at regional levels and others are important in pushing us to do what is right, to live up to the principle of leaving no one behind. And that is really a panacea for the problems we are having. And the 17 goals are extremely important and they affect all countries. I think it's positive that we can talk as humanity that these are important goals at a minimum that we should achieve. I think this is what the UN should continue to work with others to guarantee, regardless of the difficulties, and try to lessen the difficulties in terms of the gaps of income, political power around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you very much. Well, I do believe that greater cooperation is a more promising, a more effective path than the type of unilateralism and transactionalism that we have witnessed over the last decade. I think there is no way around cooperative approaches when dealing with transnational risks and threats. And cooperation does not require giving something away. States should see the self-interest, the national interest of working together with other countries and through regional and international organizations. And perhaps my last point, I think what we need is political commitment. We need leadership for taking care of these multilateral fora. We need to invest in them if we want them to be effective, to be performing.
Okay. Tijjani Muhammad-Bande, Hina Rabbani Khar, Andreas Wimmer, and Thomas Greminger, thank you very much for joining here, making your presence felt at the 5th edition of the TRT World Forum. Thank you very much to all of you. I do appreciate your time and your analysis. Well, this ends this session of the TRT World Forum on the future of sovereignty in an interdependent world. Thank you very much for joining us.